Moving on now to a look at the U.S. economy, and not only to the state of it, but how it's being perceived by Americans. Despite a slow recovery on some fronts, when asked the likeliness of the U.S. having another Great Depression similar to the one in the 1930s, the majority of Americans say yes, or at least probably yes. Take a look at this. 19% of Americans say it's very likely, and 29% say somewhat likely. That's nearly half of Americans who believe we will return to a time when 25% of workers were unemployed, banks across the country failed, and millions of ordinary Americans were temporarily homeless or unable to feed their families. All right, so what's happening to lead people to this conclusion? I'm joined here in studio by political columnist Harold Meyerson. And Harold, let's talk about this. I mean, some frightening figures by Americans. And also today, just in trying to combat this, two lawmakers just a few hours ago, we saw right here in Washington, a congressman from Virginia and a senator from Virginia, Mark Warner, Congressman Frank Wolf. They announced that they're going to be pushing legislation that actually rewards companies for bringing jobs that were lost back to the U.S. So I want to start off just by asking you, how likely do you think this is, not just that legislation will pass, but that this will work?
Well, it's not clear any legislation can pass in the current Congress, but that said, I think what this initiative addresses is the fact that it's not clear where private sector jobs are going to come from in the United States at this point. And I think that's what's behind those poll figures that you cited just a moment ago. Most of our major Standard & Poor's 500 companies, our biggest corporations, are investing abroad. They're not investing here. Labor is cheaper. There are industrial policies in the countries we go to, or whether they're high-end countries in Europe or developing countries in Asia, that really are welcoming to these companies. And there's a great deal of automation going on within the manufacturing process here, so that jobs are just not being generated and wages are totally stuck, if not declining. It's a bad situation. So I think that kind of legislation before would have been off the table. Right now, something like that might have a prayer.
Certainly people look at manufacturing as an industry that sort of built this country up. President Obama also, singing this same tune. I know he's been trying to talk about this. He's spoken several times, and I have one example, so we'll listen. I'll get your response.
I see a future where we train workers who make things here in the United States and continue an important and honorable tradition of folks working with their hands, creating value, not just shuffling paper. That's part of what has built the American dream.
So let's talk about this American dream, especially regarding manufacturing and jobs in the U.S. What needs to happen?
Well, several things need to happen. I think the corporate model in America is a lot of the problem. You take corporations, which since about 1980 say, well, we're really only responsible to our shareholders, not our communities, not our workers. And you put that in the context of globalization. Well, shareholders say you can get a high profit making things in China. Apple, maybe a paradigmatic model American company right now, has all of its product actually made in China, not in this country. So they have some tens of thousands of well-paid designers and marketers here, but hundreds of thousands of production workers abroad, no production workers here. That's a tough nut to crack. I think we do need the kind of ideas that Senator Warner and Congressman Wolf talked about today. I think the good point of comparison is Germany, really. Germany exports a huge amount of its product, high-end manufacturing, paying its workers, including benefits, $3 for every $2 we have here. And they're able to do that by keeping the high value-added manufacturing at home. That's partly because of a strong German tradition. It's partly because they actually have worker representatives on corporate boards, which I'd love to see here. It's a different situation, but it's working out a lot better for them than it is for us.
Such an important example that you bring up, Germany. They seem to kind of be on the right track still in terms of knowing how to handle unions and what to do with workers' rights. And we do see in such tough times Germany's economy doing pretty okay. But back to the U.S., and you mentioned some of these numbers before. I want to point to some of the examples you gave in your writings about Standard & Poor's, some of the biggest companies here in America. You said that 32% of the income of the firms in the S&P index of some of these largest companies came from abroad. Now, by 2008, that figure had grown to 48%. So that's, not a long time, not even a full decade, of a really big change in terms of where the income comes from. I guess I want to know from you, I mean, what does this say to you? And more importantly, what are the chances that these numbers can go back down again?
I think it's going to be very hard. One of the things that's fueling those numbers is the fact that you have the Chinese and Indian economy growing at 8, 9, 10% every year. You're not getting that growth here. You're not going to have that kind of growth here. That can't happen in a mature economy like ours. So if they want to be close to the where the markets are growing, they're going to be there. But again, Germany is a counterexample because, as I said, Germany exports to these countries. We do, but we import more. I think we need to have a policy really on engendering not just jobs, but decent paying jobs in this country, which still exist for professionals, but are quickly disappearing everywhere else.
And I know another thing that you wrote about, you pointed to among the things that are flawed, not just certain things that are going on, but also the discussion that's being had here in the U.S. about the economy, that, you know, instead of debating cyclical versus structural in terms of the different types of things that are going on, you know, for example, those who argue that public spending can restore prosperity versus those who say, you know, American workers need to learn different trades. You say there's something that we're missing here in the discussion.
Well, it's institutional. I mean, American corporations are behaving as they should if their goal is simply to reward shareholders. That doesn't work in a globalized economy.
And they're behaving as they should if they're in a place where they can get away with it.
Well, yes, and you can get away with it here. In a sense, the whole culture is skewed towards offshoring in this country. And that's a dangerous thing, and millions and millions of Americans are paying the price for that. So I think if we took workers more seriously, and that requires some legislative changes, I think if we did invest more in infrastructure, that would help, education as well. But there are fundamental things about corporate flight in this country that I think are very deep and are going to be hard to address. I would love to see legislation such as that suggested by our Virginia legislators that really did reward companies for creating jobs here as distinct from jobs abroad.
All right, political columnist Harold Meyerson, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.